Off the coast of Massachusetts, near the town of Cohasset, there is a rock that spends most of its life underwater. It is called Minot's Ledge, and for a few hours around low tide it shows its black back above the waves, and the rest of the time it lurks just beneath the surface, invisible, in the middle of the shipping lanes that lead into Boston. For as long as ships had sailed that coast, the ledge had been killing them, tearing the bottoms out of vessels that never saw it coming, drowning sailors within sight of land. It was one of the deadliest rocks on the whole eastern seaboard. And so, in the middle of the 1800s, Americans decided to do the obvious thing and put a lighthouse on it. What followed was a disaster, and then a tragedy, and then one of the most magnificent feats of engineering ever accomplished on this continent. The first lighthouse they built on that ledge was a flimsy, spidery thing, an iron skeleton on legs drilled into the rock, and from the day it was lit, almost everyone who saw it or lived in it believed it was going to fall. And one terrible night in the spring of 1851, in a great storm, it did fall, and it took two young lighthouse keepers with it, two men who kept the light burning and the bell ringing to the very end, and threw a message into the sea in a bottle, because they knew they were going to die. And here is the part that lifts this story out of pure tragedy. After the sea destroyed that lighthouse and killed those men, Americans went back to the same deadly ledge and built a second one, not of iron, but of granite. More than 1,000 blocks of it dovetailed together like a stone puzzle, and that tower has stood on Minot's Ledge, through every storm the Atlantic has thrown at it, for more than 160 years, and it has never moved. I want to tell you the whole story, because it is one of the great forgotten dramas of American engineering, and everyone in it deserves to be remembered. The two keepers who died were named Joseph Antoine and Joseph Wilson. The engineer who built the granite tower that finally beat the ledge was named Barton Alexander. And the tale runs from one of the worst engineering failures of the age to one of its greatest triumphs, on the very same rock. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. Start with the ledge, because the ledge is the villain of the whole story. Minot's Ledge is part of a scatter of rocks off Cohasset that mariners simply called a graveyard. Ships bound for Boston from the south had to thread past them, and the ledge sat there, mostly hidden, waiting. Over the years, it wrecked dozens upon dozens of vessels and took countless lives, and everyone who knew that coast agreed that something had to be built to mark it. But how do you build anything on a rock that is underwater most of the day? There is no island there, no dry land, nothing to stand a building on. For a few hours at low tide, you have a wet black rock awash in the swell, and then the sea comes back and covers it. Putting a lighthouse there was, from the very beginning, a problem at the outer edge of what anyone knew how to do. It is worth understanding just how much death was bound up in that one rock, because it is the reason anyone was willing to risk so much to mark it. The approach to Boston from the south runs right past the Cohasset shore, and the whole area is a maze of half-hidden rocks and ledges, of which Minot's was the outermost and the worst. Ship after ship over the decades misjudged the passage in fog or darkness or storm and drove onto those rocks, and the wrecks were not gentle. A vessel that struck the ledge in a heavy sea could be pounded to pieces in minutes, and its people spilled into cold water within sight of the lights of shore, close enough to see safety and far too far to reach it. The people of Cohasset grew grimly used to the aftermath, to bodies and cargo coming up on the beaches after a bad night. By the 1840s, the toll had become intolerable, a steady, predictable harvest of ships and lives taken by a rock everyone knew was there and no one could adequately mark. That was the pressure behind everything that followed. It was worth almost any risk and any expense to get a light onto Minot's Ledge, because the alternative was to keep feeding ships and sailors to it, year after year. One wreck in particular haunted that coast in exactly those years. In the autumn of 1849, just as the first lighthouse was going up, a brig called the St. John, packed with immigrants fleeing the famine in Ireland, was driven onto the Cohasset rocks in a gale, within sight of shore, and broke apart in the surf. Something like 100 people, whole families who had crossed an ocean looking for a new life, drowned in the breakers a stone's throw from land, and their bodies came ashore for days afterward. The writer Henry David Thoreau happened to be traveling through and saw the aftermath, the scattered clothing, the rough coffins on the beach, the terrible ordinary grief of it, and he wrote it down. That was the coast these lighthouses were built to guard, and that was the price, in human lives, of every year those rocks went unmarked. When people fought so hard and risked so much to put a light on Minot's Ledge, that is what they were fighting against. Not an abstraction, the St. John, families in the surf. The answer the government reached for in the late 1840s was a new and fashionable design called an iron pile lighthouse. Instead of a solid tower, which everyone assumed could not be built on such a spot, they would drill a set of iron legs, iron piles, down into the rock, brace them together, and perch the keeper's house and the light up on top of them, high above the waves. The theory was elegant. A skeleton of open ironwork would let the storm waves pass harmlessly between the legs instead of slamming into a solid wall. It was cheaper than stone and faster to build, and it let them get a light onto the ledge at all, which had seemed impossible. The first Minot's Ledge light was built between 1847 and 1850, and on the first day of January 1850, its lamp was lit, 90 feet or so above the deadly rock, and the graveyard finally had its warning. The man who designed and built that first tower was an army engineer named William Swift, and on paper, his iron pile idea was genuinely advanced for its day. The whole point of it was to give the storm as little as possible to grab. A solid tower presents a broad wall for a wave to strike with its full weight. A skeleton of thin iron legs, in theory, lets the water rush harmlessly between them, so that even a great wave passes through the structure instead of slamming into it. And simply getting the legs into the ledge at all was a real feat. His crews had to drill deep holes down into that tidal rock, in the same maddening low-tide windows that would later torment the men who built the granite tower, and set 9 great iron piles into them, braced together, rising some 60 feet, with the keeper's quarters and the lantern room built up on top. When it was finished, it looked less like a lighthouse than like a strange iron insect standing in the sea, and for a little while it was hailed as a clever triumph, a light where a light had seemed impossible. The trouble was that the theory and the reality did not agree, and the people who found that out first were the ones who had to live inside it. There was only one problem. The people who actually had to live in it were terrified of it. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. Because a skeleton tower on thin iron legs, out in the open Atlantic, moves. In any real sea, the whole structure would sway and shudder and flex on its legs, up there above the waves, and to the men whose job it was to stay in it through the storms, that swaying did not feel clever. It felt like a warning. The very first keeper lasted about 10 months before he quit, convinced the thing was unsafe. The keeper who followed him had the same grave doubts. Even the writer Henry David Thoreau, who visited that coast, recorded that the lighthouse rocked so badly in a gale that it shook the plates right off the table. Everyone who spent time in that tower came away with the same feeling in the pit of the stomach, that the iron legs were not enough, that one big storm, the right storm, would be the end of it. They were right. They were simply unlucky enough to be proven right in the worst possible way. And it is important to understand that the men who would die in that tower were not fools ignoring an obvious danger. Everyone knew the danger. The keepers had reported it, over and over, up the chain, that the tower swayed alarmingly in heavy weather, that they did not trust the iron legs, that something needed to be done before a great storm came. Requests were made to strengthen it, warnings were filed, and, as so often happens, the machinery of the government moved slowly, and the money was slow to come, and the strengthening had not been done when the sea finally sent the storm that mattered. The men on that ledge were standing a post they had every reason to fear, in a structure they had said out loud was unsafe, because that was the job they had been given, and the light had to be kept. That is the quiet, ordinary heroism at the heart of this story, men keeping a watch they knew might kill them, because it was their duty to keep it. The storm came in the middle of April, in 1851. It was a tremendous gale, one that battered the whole Boston region and drove the sea up into a fury. And out on Minot's Ledge, in the swaying iron tower, there were 2 young assistant keepers on duty, Joseph Antoine and Joseph Wilson. The head keeper was ashore. As the storm built through the day and into the night, the seas rose higher than anyone had seen them at the ledge, and the tower began to work and groan on its legs in a way that must have told the 2 men inside exactly what was coming. And here is what those 2 young men did, knowing what they knew. They stayed. They kept the lamps lit, so that any ship out in that chaos would have its warning. They kept the great fog bell ringing, hour after hour, a sound that people on shore reported hearing through the storm, tolling from the doomed tower out in the dark. They did their duty, in other words, long past the point where any reasonable person would have thought only of escape, because there was no escape, and because keeping that light and that bell going was the whole reason they were there. And at some point in that long night, understanding that the tower might not last until morning, they did one more thing. They wrote a message, a note to the outside world, and they sealed it in a bottle and cast it into the raging sea, so that whatever happened to them, someone might know they had been there and had held their post to the end. Just before 1 o'clock in the morning on the 17th of April, the sea finally won. The iron legs gave way, and the whole tower, light and bell and the two keepers with it, was torn off the ledge and swept into the Atlantic. Joseph Antoine's body was later found washed ashore at Nantasket. Joseph Wilson managed, somehow, to reach a small rock nearby, probably thinking in the dark that he had reached the mainland, and there, out of the water but exposed to the storm, he died of cold and exhaustion. Both men were gone. The lighthouse built to save lives on that ledge had, in the end, taken the lives of the two men who tended it. On shore, through that whole night, people had known something terrible was happening. The great fog bell out on the ledge had tolled on and on through the height of the storm, carried in on the wind, and then, in the small hours, it had stopped. The silence where the bell had been told the story before anyone could see it. When the weather cleared enough to look, the tower was simply gone. Where the iron light had stood, there was only the bare ledge again, washed by the waves, and a scatter of twisted iron. The search for the keepers began along the beaches, the way it always did after a wreck on that coast. And in time, the sea gave up Joseph Antoine at Nantasket and Joseph Wilson on his lonely rock. The message the two of them had sealed in a bottle and thrown to the ocean in their last hours was their voice reaching shore after they themselves were gone. The words of two young men who had done everything right and been failed by the very thing they were standing in. New England mourned them, and the shock of it, the horror that the nation's clever new lighthouse had killed its own keepers, made absolutely certain that whatever went back onto that ledge next would never be allowed to fail. Before I tell you what happened next, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless enough people click. One click. Come back. The loss of the tower and the death of the two keepers shook the whole region, and it left the country with a hard question. The ledge was still there. It was still deadly. Ships still needed a light on it. And the first, clever, modern answer had just been ripped apart by the sea and had killed two men doing it. For nearly a decade, the government did the only thing it safely could, and stationed a lightship, an anchored vessel with a light, near the ledge to warn traffic. But a lightship was a stopgap, and everyone knew it. Sooner or later, someone was going to have to go back out to Minot's Ledge and build something on it that the Atlantic could not destroy. And this time, they were not going to do it on the cheap, and they were not going to do it with a skeleton of iron legs. This time, they were going to build a mountain. That decision did not come quickly or easily. For most of a decade, while the lightship rode at anchor near the ledge, the question of what to build and how was argued and studied. Building a solid stone tower on a rock that lay underwater most of the day was so daunting that serious people doubted it could be done at all. But the finest engineering minds of the Lighthouse Board bent themselves to the problem, among them a distinguished old Army engineer named Joseph Totten, and slowly a plan took shape that was audacious in its very simplicity. If the sea could destroy anything you perched above it on legs, then you would not perch anything above it. You would meet the ocean head-on, with a mass of solid stone so great and so cunningly knit together that the waves could do nothing to it at all. The plan that emerged, drawn up for the Lighthouse Board and carried out by an Army engineer named Barton Alexander, threw out the whole idea of a light structure that let the waves pass through. Instead, it called for the exact opposite, a solid tower of stone, a single massive column of granite so heavy and so strong that the sea could break against it forever and never move it. And the genius of it was in how the stones were fitted together. This was not going to be a stack of blocks that a wave could shove apart. Every single granite block in the tower was cut so that it interlocked with its neighbors, dovetailed, notched into the stones around it and above and below it like the pieces of a wooden puzzle box, and then locked further with great iron dowels driven through them. The whole tower, more than 1,000 separate stones, would be knitted together into what was effectively one solid piece of rock, one artificial boulder in the shape of a lighthouse, that the ocean could pound at until the end of time without ever prying loose a single block. The idea was not entirely new. On the far side of the Atlantic, British engineers had spent the previous century learning, at terrible cost, how to build stone towers that could stand in the open sea, most famously on the Eddystone Rocks off England and the Bell Rock off Scotland, where they had pioneered this very trick of dovetailing each stone into the next until a wave-swept tower became a single interlocked mass. The Americans building Minot's Ledge were drawing on that hard-won knowledge and pushing it further, onto a ledge as cruel as any in the world. And the principle behind it is beautifully simple once you see it. A stone that merely sits on top of another stone can be slid, or lifted, or rolled away by a great enough force, and the ocean applies a great enough force all day and all night. But a stone that is notched into the ones around it, cut so that its neighbors would have to move before it could, cannot be taken by the sea without taking the whole tower, and the whole tower is far too heavy to take. Knit 1,000 such stones together and lock them through with iron, and you have made something the Atlantic simply cannot get a grip on. That was the entire secret, and it was the whole difference between a lighthouse that lasted a single winter and one that has lasted 3 lifetimes. But designing such a thing was the easy part. Building it, on that ledge, was almost beyond belief. Remember the fundamental problem: the ledge is underwater most of the day. It only shows itself for a few hours around low tide, and then only in calm enough weather to land a boat and get men and stone onto the wet rock. So the crews could only work in short, snatched windows, a couple of hours at a stretch, a handful of usable days in a month, waiting always for the tide and the weather to allow it. The lowest courses of the tower, the ones down at the level of the rock itself, were the worst, because they had to be cut and set into the ledge in that narrow gap between the tides, with the sea always rushing back to drive the men off. Every one of those foundation stones was a battle against the clock and the ocean. It took years of that, years of landing on the rock whenever the sea briefly allowed it, laying a few stones, and retreating before the tide returned. And the stones themselves were prepared with extraordinary care back on shore. The granite came from Quincy, Massachusetts, famous for its stone, and there, on dry land, the more than 1,000 blocks were cut and dressed and fitted to their exact interlocking shapes, and each one was numbered, so that the whole tower was in effect built once as a trial on shore, taken apart, and then shipped out to the ledge and rebuilt, stone by numbered stone, in the sea. In the end, it took 1,079 blocks of granite, weighing together more than 3,500 tons, to raise the tower. Every one of them was carried out to the ledge by ship, hoisted onto that wet rock in the brief windows the tide allowed, and locked into its exact place in the rising column. On the 15th of November 1860, 9 years after the first tower fell, the new light was lit, a solid granite tower more than 100 feet tall, standing on the deadly ledge like it had grown there. It is worth dwelling on what those 9 years actually asked of the men who built it, because this was not a job you could push through with enough workers and enough money. The ledge set the pace, and the ledge was merciless. In a whole year of work, the hours actually spent laying stone out on the rock might add up to only a few weeks, because everything depended on catching the rare stretches when the tide was low and the sea was calm enough to land a boat. The men would watch the water and the sky, race out to the ledge the moment a window opened, work furiously to drill and fit and set stone into the growing base, and then flee before the returning tide drowned the work again. The lowest part of the tower, some 40 feet of it, was built as a nearly solid mass of that interlocking granite, a plug of dovetailed stone keyed into the rock of the ledge itself, so that the base of the lighthouse is not really a hollow tower at all, but a solid mountain of knitted stone, and only higher up, safely above the reach of the worst seas, does it open into rooms. And every stone had been rehearsed on land. The entire tower was assembled once as a dry run in the granite yard at Quincy, every block cut and numbered, and proven to fit its neighbors perfectly, before a single one of them ever went out to the sea. It was one of the most patient and difficult construction projects the country had ever attempted, and Barton Alexander held it together, season after season, tide after tide, for 9 years, until the mountain was made. One quick note: I turned the full story into a book, everything the records gave me. If you want it, the link is in the description. And it has never moved since. For more than 160 years, through hurricane after hurricane, through nor'easters that have flung the whole weight of the Atlantic against it, the granite tower on Minot's Ledge has stood exactly where Barton Alexander's men set it. Unmoved, unbroken, the waves exploding against its base, and streaming off its stones, and changing nothing. Where the clever iron skeleton had lasted a single winter before the sea destroyed it and killed its keepers, the stubborn granite mountain has shrugged off everything the ocean has thrown at it for a century and a half. It is considered, rightly, one of the great engineering achievements in American history, and engineers still study it as a model of how to build against the sea and win. And once it was built, men lived in it, of course, because a lighthouse needs its keepers, and duty on Minot's Ledge, even in the mighty granite tower, was never easy. The keepers were sealed into a stone column out in the open Atlantic, reached only by boat when the sea allowed, and in a heavy storm they would feel the whole solid tower take the blows of the waves, a deep shudder running up through 3,000 tons of granite, and hear the ocean roaring against the stone beneath their feet. It was safe now, in a way the iron tower had never been. But it was still one of the loneliest and most exposed postings in the entire lighthouse service. Keepers tended that light by hand for the better part of a century, until at last, in the middle of the 20th century, the light was automated and the last keeper came ashore, and the great granite tower went on doing its work alone, without a soul inside it, exactly as it does to this day. There is one last detail, and it is the one that has made Minot's Ledge beloved rather than just admired. The light was set to flash in a particular rhythm, a pattern of 1 flash, then 4, then 3, 1, 4, 3. And at some point, someone looking out at it from the shore counted those flashes and realized that 1, 4, 3 could stand for the number of letters in 3 little words. I love you, and the name stuck. To this day, Minot's Ledge light is known up and down that coast as the I love you light, or the lover's light, the tower that signals those 3 words out over the water, over and over, all night, every night. There is something almost unbearably fitting in that. On a ledge that took so many lives, on a rock that killed 2 keepers who stayed at their posts to the end, the light that finally conquered it spends every night of its existence saying I love you to the darkness and the sea. Sailors and their families took that to heart. For generations, people courting along that coast have pointed the light out to one another, and mariners coming home have watched for those 3 grouped flashes as a sign they were nearly safe, nearly to Boston, nearly home. A cold, deadly rock that had done nothing for 200 years but drown people became, through a quirk of a flash pattern and a bit of human tenderness, the most romantic lighthouse in America. It is a strange and lovely thing that we did that we took the worst rock on the coast and taught its light to say the kindest words in the language. But it fits, somehow, because a lighthouse is at bottom an act of love anyway, a fire kept burning by one set of strangers to bring another set of strangers safely home through the dark. Minot's Ledge just happens to say it out loud. I think about what a modern engineer sees when he looks at Minot's Ledge light, because the 2 towers together are a perfect lesson written in the sea. He sees, in the first tower, the danger of a clever idea that has not been proven against the worst the world can do, an elegant, cheap, fashionable design that worked beautifully right up until the storm that mattered, and then failed completely and fatally. And he sees in the second the brute, patient, expensive wisdom that finally answered the ledge. More than 1,000 stones cut to interlock, locked with iron, set one at a time in the few hours a month the sea would allow, until the tower was not really a building on the rock, but had become part of the rock itself. The lesson is old, and it is hard, and it is written in the lives of 2 young keepers. Against the real fury of the ocean, cleverness is not enough. Only mass and patience and stone knitted into stone will stand. That is the thing I want to leave you with. We remember, when we remember it at all, the beautiful granite tower and the sweet story of the I love you light. But underneath that tower, in the story of that ledge, are 2 young men named Joseph Antoine and Joseph Wilson, who rang a bell into a storm they knew would kill them, and threw their last words into the sea in a bottle, and kept a light burning for ships they would never see, until the ocean took them. The granite tower that stands there now, unbreakable, saying its 3 words to the night, is in a real sense their monument, built on the exact spot where they died, built so massively and so well that no keeper would ever be lost on Minot's Ledge again. They paid for the lesson. The engineers who came after learned it, and the sea, which had destroyed everything men put on that rock, finally met something it could not move. Go and look at it, if you ever get the chance, from the Cohasset shore, or from a boat on a calm day. It does not look like much from a distance, a plain gray finger of stone standing out of the water. But hold in your mind, as you look, everything it is standing on. The 100 famine emigrants in the surf, the 2 young keepers and their bottle, the 9 years of men racing the tide with numbered blocks of Quincy granite. The whole long, hard, deadly lesson about what it takes to stand against the sea and win. It is all there, pressed into that quiet stone tower, flashing its 3 small words at the night. That is worth remembering. That is worth saying out loud. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.